Right. Okay. So welcome everyone to our webinar. It's really amazing to see so many of you here this early this morning. As I said, you're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat box. The session is being recorded. We'll be using this to publish on our YouTube channel and on our website. I'll be sharing the link with you all at after the presentations, so that if you want to share it or if you want to watch it again, you're welcome to. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end and throughout the sessions. If you do feel the need to ask a question, can you please use the Q&A box? If you look at the bottom bar in Excel, you should see Zoom, you should see a Q&A box. So you can put your questions in there as the session progresses. And we'll relay those at the end to our panelists. A quick introduction on Changing Futures. Well, Changing Futures, we see it very much as a resource for Bristol. We're a programme funded by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities and the National Lottery Community Fund. We work as a partnership to improve local services for adults and young people who face multiple disadvantage. Our aim is to create sustainable change at individual service and system levels and to influence government policy and local commissioning. Now, we can't change the system without you, so I do want to thank you for joining us today on this webinar, because that is you helping us change the system in some way. All our work is looked at through 3 separate lenses: co-production with those who have lived experience of multiple disadvantage, trauma-informed practice, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Today, our webinar is focusing mostly on the latter 2, so trauma-informed practice and EDI. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that racial trauma is a very emotive topic, and it is possible that some of today's conversation might make you feel uncomfortable. It's okay to sit within that discomfort. However, I also think it's important to recognise that it can be a triggering topic for some, and you need to look after your well-being. I can't see you because it's a webinar, so I can't look after you in the same way that I would if you were in the same room as us. So if you need to leave for a moment to catch your breath, please do. As I mentioned, the webinar is recorded, so you can catch up on anything you've missed in your own time. Finally, before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to preface today's session by saying 1 hour is never going to be enough to cover everything there is to say about racial trauma and allyship. However, we're hoping that this will be the start of a conversation and that it might leave you with some tools to help you on your journey. So, our panelists today are Themba Mahari, who is Changing Futures EDI lead. Helen Emmings is Changing Futures Trauma-Informed lead. And Victoria Fair is Deputy Director of SARI, one of our partners. SARI stands for Stand Against Racism and Inequality. SARI is a charity that supports victims of hate crimes and leads on equality work across Bristol, Avon, and Somerset. So let's get started. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask the panelists some questions that will be leading on discussions. So I'll start with Themba. What is racial trauma and what is its impact?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah Jane. Morning, everyone. I hope you're well. And thank you for everyone for attending this needed webinar. And we're hoping that we're all going to leave with something and that we can share with our colleagues and families and friends. So I'm going to start off with the definition of racial trauma. And racial trauma refers to the stressful impact and emotional pain an individual suffers from the experiences of racism. And it's the cumulative effects, of racism on our mental and on our physical health. And it can be experienced vicariously or directly. And I was really thinking around how we can really sort of not condense, but really touch on certain elements and the impacts that racial trauma can have on people. And I think the most important way to start is by explaining how the experiences of race-based discrimination can really have significant psychological impacts on people. And in some of those prolonged incidences of racism, they can lead to symptoms that lead those experiences of post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's 5 things I really think that demonstrate the impact of racial trauma and how that can have on people. I'm going to start off with history, is the education system, the healthcare system, policing, and media. And I think it was really important to share some research as well, just to really sort of demonstrate the importance of having these conversations and really show the impact racial trauma can have on people. And history we've seen throughout the years and conversations around slavery, the impact that can have on people. So according to Psychology Today, this is research they done in 2020, hearing stories from ancestors and from the older generation who experienced tragic racial incidences and having to witness those experiences can really have an impact on people. And I don't know if you've heard the term around intergenerational trauma. So the impact that this can have on family members who hear these stories. And I can speak for myself, that feeling of helplessness when sometimes I hear my grandmother talk about stories that happened, whether it's in the 60s or in the 50s. And that really can have an impact on an individual and on our friends, on our colleagues, on the people that we socialize with. And it's important to highlight that and the impact that history has. So we're a program based in Bristol, and Bristol has a history, and conversations around slavery and even the Colston statue and all those conversations that came out from that really highlights the impact that can have on society and on individuals within this community. Another impact that I think is really important, another thing that really highlights the impact of racial trauma, I think, is education. The education system. So according to Mind, 2019, research was carried out by Mind, a mental health charity, and they found that 55% of young people from Black and British backgrounds and 57% from mixed ethnic backgrounds experience racism at school. And when I looked at those figures, I was like, that's really quite staggering to feel that over 50% of people from Black and British backgrounds and people from mixed ethnic backgrounds experience racism at school. And we know the impact that can have on a child and even adults. Again, from personal experience, those feelings of questioning yourself, not putting your hand up in class anymore because you're questioning, ooh, is this because of this? And that horrible feeling of always feeling like something, there's a terminology out there around imposter syndrome and always feeling that you have to prove yourself, and how that translates into your adult life and how you have to unlearn certain things. So that, I think, is really quite important to highlight. And it again demonstrates the impact racial trauma can have on people. The healthcare system. So according to the British Medical Association, some research, a survey was done in 2020 with more than 2,000 doctors and medical students. And just over 90% of Black and Asian respondents and 73% of mixed ethnicity and 64% of white respondents said they believed racism in the medical profession was an issue. Now, when I read that, I was a bit like, whew, to feel, again, seeing how that trauma can come up in the medical sector, and highlighting the fact that professionals are aware that there's some racial issues and the impact that can have on their clients or on their patients, I think is really important for us to be aware of. And this is across the board. So we can think of mental health and we can think of general hospitals as well, and how that affects employees, clients, and colleagues. And then the fourth one I'm going to touch on is policing. So this came from the Race Action Plan 2022. So these are, we will share all these, Esther will share all the links and all the information after this webinar. And that in the Race Action Plan 2022 found that Black men are over 3 times as likely to be arrested than white men, with 60 arrests per 1,000 Black men, compared with 17 for every 1,000 white men. Now, when I looked at that 60 and 17, I was looking at how that is really, really a big gap. And we've seen over the years a lot of research, a lot of resources have been put in addressing these issues around the stop and search stuff and around arrests and stereotypes that happen within policing. And it really just highlights the impact that can have on an individual. And again, from experience for myself, even sometimes when I'm driving, little things that just come, even if, I mean, I'm all fine, everything's okay, but just those feelings of, ooh, have I done something wrong? Have I done this? And those feelings are really, really, really hard to explain sometimes. It's just that feeling of that constant anxiety and overthinking and wondering, oh, what's going on? It's just because of this or that. And I think that really highlights trauma itself and how that can play out in different ways. And then the last point I'm going to touch on really is around the media. We know that social media is very, very powerful, and the media in general is very, very powerful. And the National Alliance did some really interesting research around, so the National Alliance on Mental Illness did some research in 2022, talking about racial bias and stereotypes and how they can be re-traumatizing. So just clarification, racial bias is not racism. Racial bias is a bias because, based on race. And everyone has some level of implicit bias, and it's important to recognize this. And this is why we are here talking about allyship and supporting each other. And it found that a lot of things through media, film, can have profound effects on one's mental health and well-being. And these psychologically damaging experiences are ongoing systemic racism can really exacerbate through reoccurring circulation of videos. We have seen the unfortunate events in 2020 of George Floyd and many other things that have been going on throughout the media, and how that can have an impact on individuals. And everyone has that coping mechanisms. My coping mechanism is that I don't go and play those videos. I don't watch them or see them when they're going viral and all that kind of stuff, just to protect my mental health and well-being. And it is really important to highlight the impact that media has on racial trauma, and being aware how sometimes colleagues can bring things into work, into family homes, into social settings, based on what's come up from social media or just the media in general. So those are the 5 things that I thought were really important to touch on. As SJ mentioned, this is a conversation that can be extended. This is a very big conversation. And yes, I think I'll leave it there.
Victoria or Helen, did you have any thoughts on the impact of racial trauma?
Yeah, no, I think Temba's really captured it well. I think for everybody out there, we just need to understand that it can definitely shape how people interact with those around them, how they navigate the world around them, and how they kind of, I guess, the trust that they can put in people or services as well. And to kind of understand that, you know, people are experiencing racial trauma, you know, we also need to know, I guess, for people working with people that experience racial trauma, sometimes the mistrust kind of lies within that. And so you might represent something that in their life that has kind of been kind of facilitating that trauma or exacerbating that trauma. So yeah, it's just kind of understanding that it's not necessarily always personal to you, but it's kind of a bigger issue in that a lot of trust needs to be built because of past experiences, lived experiences as well. So yeah.
Okay, so losing my papers, sorry. Our next question, I will start with Helen on this one. How do we create safe spaces to hold those rather difficult conversations around racial trauma?
Thanks, Sarah Jane, and thanks, Temba. That was fab. You're right. It's a really, really big subject, but it's so important to start this conversation. So in terms of safe spaces, it's something that it's a phrase we use quite readily as almost a throwaway. And I think it's really important that we start by kind of clarifying the sense that spaces doesn't just refer to places and physical spaces that we inhabit or that we hold meetings or where we physically hold those conversations. Actually, safe spaces are about those senses of psychological safety, emotional safety. It's about how we interact in those conversations as well as where we hold them. So it's very important, I suppose, not to be to be considering safe spaces about just how do we physically hold a meeting, how do we physically have those conversations. The creation of safe spaces sort of sits quite neatly within the trauma-informed principles. So what we understand around trauma-informed practice, around the development of a sense of safety, the exploration of choice and clarity, around collaboration, trustworthiness, empowerment and inclusivity. And where we're not considering those principles, the space will automatically struggle to be effective and will automatically feel unsafe for some of the participants. So it's really important, I suppose, when we're thinking about how we embark on conversations around racial trauma, that we have in our minds, at the forefront of our minds, always those kind of principles of how we best support trauma-informed practice. And those principles are also underpinned by other elements around communication and how we build relationships and connection. So the safety in a space comes from those connections and those relationships that we form. The sense of being human and being flexible, the idea that actually there's no formula or script to these things. There's a sense that there's a risk of getting it wrong. There's a risk of saying things that maybe won't be interpreted in the way they were intended, but being human about that and about embracing that nevertheless is so critical in terms of making those spaces feel safe. There's also a difference around individual and organisational conversations around racial trauma. There's something about on an individual level where we're having conversations with the people we know, the people in our lives personally, individuals on a one-to-one, that we're looking then to build a relationship on an individual level where that space feels safe, where we're thinking about those trauma-informed principles on a human person one-to-one level, and where we're offering that space wholeheartedly with authenticity, and where we're being brave and courageous about offering that space on a one-to-one and saying overtly, really, we recognise that this conversation might be turned down, that we might be rejected, that it's not the right time to have that conversation, but we offer that space wholeheartedly nevertheless. That we know that one of the key ingredients is about sitting and hearing and listening. Listening is a process. It's not something that you can do without conscious thought, and it's so important to embrace that, so that that individual that you're having that conversation with feels that they're being heard, appreciated and supported. But there are slight differences when we think about these conversations and safe spaces in an organizational context and in a system context, that actually safe spaces of this nature can be complicated. There are some things to really keep in mind. So we must recognize that a physical space isn't sufficient if the culture of the organization or the team doesn't feel safe and doesn't support the taking of the steps necessary to support that space. So simply providing a meeting or a forum or a group, a room to have that space won't create safety on its own. It's not a case of if you build it, they will come. It's that sense of actually, we really do need to be embracing the whole picture, that we need to be allowing for the depth and breadth of conversation to come through, and for the organisational structures and policies and procedures and everything else involved to be there to underpin and to hold that conversation and to take those things away with meaning, so that the individuals that are involved in those spaces feel that it's valued, that it's something that's actually going to have an impact. I think we also sort of need to think about in safe spaces the appreciation and respect of the vulnerability of ourselves and others in coming together to have those conversations about racial trauma and allyship. There's a need for a recognition and ownership of power and privilege, and the value of feeling really uncomfortable and sitting with that discomfort. That's an essential part of demonstrating and feeling compassion and creating a space that we can learn from. I like to think about feedback as being something of a gift, that any feedback you receive, whether it's positive, negative, hard to hear, uncomfortable, is a gift, because it is something that we can then use and take and develop from and learn from, that it's not something that we should be shying away from. And actually, all the time that you are demonstrating your willingness to take feedback and to give feedback, you're creating a safe that's authentic and that demonstrates your ambition to truly respond to what you're hearing. There's some research and discussion around the idea of ego in creating safe spaces as well, which is interesting to think about. So ego is part of our primitive reptilian brain, and it's only concerned with self-preservation. So if we allow our ego to speak for us, then we only speak of the things that serve our self-interest, and they close down opportunities to listen and learn. So where we're alert to the impact of our ego, we've got the opportunity to feel the emotion, but to respond with our conscious mind rather than our kind of reptilian mind. And I suppose perhaps the most important thing when thinking about safe spaces for conversations, particularly around racial trauma, is in recognizing that conversations are a process and not a one-off. The impact of racial trauma is deeply rooted and experienced differently by individuals and communities, and spaces created for the exploration of these things should be an invitation to start the process of discussion and learning, not a promise to resolve the problem that day or to seek a quick fix, because a space that feels as if a solution to something so complicated is the only goal, then it will feel inherently unsafe because it's seeking the impossible, and everyone knows that. So there's that risk of feeling tokenistic. So I guess it's about kind of really valuing the sense that this is a starter for 10 and it's a process that we're all committed to. I'll leave it at that, sorry.
I can see a lot of nodding from Temba and Victoria there. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on any of this.
No, thank you ever so much, Helen. And I think there's a lot of stuff that you said there that I think is really, really important. And one thing that really stood out for me was around that this is a process, and listening to people and being there for people. And it's not just a one-off. When we have these conversations, I think what tends to happen is if an incident has happened, naturally as humans, I guess the thing is to be there for that person. But I think it's really, really important to understand on the human level that these things take time. Some people want to speak about it there and there. Some people wait 3 months down the line and want to have that conversation. And I think that's the human thing to do. And I loved you mentioned as well about the humanity element, and it is about that. And this is what allyship's about. And this is what recognizing trauma, not just racial trauma, all forms of trauma. It's just about understanding that everyone is going through that process. And yeah, you said a lot of stuff that I kept nodding my head. I kept on shaking my head like, yep. But yeah, thank you ever so much.
All right. Victoria, I'm going to put the next question to you. How do we model allyship?
Thank you everyone so far. So yeah, I think some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about kind of filters from what both Temba and Helen have said as well. So, but yeah, when we talk about allyship, when we consider allyship, it's really important to see it as something that we're committed to doing, as opposed to an act of a one-off, like Temba just mentioned, a one-off act of I don't know, satisfying some form of guilt or something that we've developed or something like that. So it's not really a checklist activity, it's a commitment, and I think that's really important to understand when we're talking about it. And because it's a commitment, it's something that you intend to do, it's intentional, it should be ongoing, and because it's ongoing, because it's a commitment, because it's intentional, it's active essentially. So we're being active in our allyship. And I think if we consider active allyship, then we start to think about, okay, what can I actually do in portraying my allyship? So it means that we'll continue engaging in our support for another group, essentially, that we're really curious, really, to learn and understand, want to understand as far as we can about the group that we're supporting, about those that we are supporting. And to be able to do that, we're looking at the lived experiences of those that we support and have a genuine, and I think Helen mentioned the word authentic, and I think authenticity is really important, but having a genuine, authentic curiosity for those that we are looking to stand alongside of, I think. And I think it's important to understand that, yeah, you stand alongside, maybe even support from behind or whatever it may be, but we're not kind of speaking over people, essentially, that are part of the group that we're supporting. And I think that's really important, where we don't take kind of the glory, I don't know, for the work that people in the group we're supporting have been really working on for many years, and then we've come along and demonstrated our allyship and then kind of take the ownership of that. So I think it's really important to not do that, but to really amplify. If you have the ability to do so, we can amplify the voices of those that we're really listening to when the opportunity comes. I don't know if you've heard of Nova Reid, hopefully you have. Nova Reid's an author, and she talks, her book's titled The Good Ally, and it's quite a detailed book actually. But I think from reading that and just my own kind of understanding, I think it's really important to be able to demonstrate being an ally, to be able to really do it successfully. I think you have to really have a good sense of self-reflection. You have to recognize the flaws in yourself, and we all have them. You have to recognize where your biases lie. You have to recognize where you demonstrate microaggressions, what attitudes you have, what stereotypes you carry, you have as well towards certain groups. So I think it's a process of working on yourself as well as demonstrating your allyship as well. So not just recognize them, but also be willing to address them and be willing to eliminate those that need to be eliminated, I think. And that's a challenge, and it's not comfortable for us to be able to do that. It's not comfortable to recognize your attitudes and, negative attitudes and your biases and stuff, but, that's not comfortable, but also nor is racism and racial trauma, so I kind of see it that way, basically, that it's not meant to make you, the ally, comfortable when people that have experienced racial trauma live with a level of uncomfortability, really. So I think when we talk about active allyship, we have to think about it on different levels, and I've kind of just hinted at that. And we think about it, we come from like an individual kind of view and what we can do. We come from an interpersonal, where we're looking at relational, and then we come from a structural, where we look more at organizational kind of allyship. And so when we talk about individual levels, we're looking, like I just said, about our own personal self-reflection, how we educate ourselves to do better, looking at our own biases and challenging them, like I said, working on ourselves. So that could be doing things such as counter stereotypic imaging, so like just counter stereotyping, so looking for imagery that goes against what you typically see, maybe in the media or whatever it may be, promoting imagery that goes against that, for example, using language that empowers, for example, when you're talking about particular groups, you know, looking at negative attitudes and reversing that, and kind of bringing in another picture into the conversation. On an interpersonal level, it's really about that relational, taking that genuine interest in those who you say that you support, you know, being really, again, authentic, wanting to develop a good relationship with people that you say you support, and really truly spending the time and to really get to know them. And through that, that's how you learn about their own experiences. It's about hearing people's voices and not trying to speak over them. And then structurally, I think this is one that we can probably all kind of relate to in one way or another, but it's all to do, I guess, to do with policies, recruitment, how you recruit, where you recruit, representation in leadership, for example, in your teams, representation that kind of filters up as opposed to just being shop floor level. And also things such as like mentorship in your organizations, and is your mentorship really truly, or have you got mentorship, and if you do, does it really truly, is it truly effective really for individuals that need to maybe have significant mentorship around, for example, racial trauma, and because that can impact you know, the job satisfaction and workability, and also ensuring that all of this isn't, again, a checklist or a tick box activity, but it's actually truly embedded in your practice. And it's something that is at the core of what you do when we're looking at this, you know. So it's not an overnight thing, but it's definitely something that is ongoing, and is something that I believe we should be bringing the voices of people that are impacted to the table to look at how we can develop our policies, how we can be better at representation and all of that. I think that way you can definitely embed it. And we must stay away from performative allyship. And I say this quite boldly, actually, that we saw this a lot during the height of the, for example, the most recent Black Lives Matters protests. We saw, I believe, a lot of performative allyship. And in that, what I mean by that is, if you think of like virtue signaling, or just kind of showing that you agree with whatever statement it is, whether you've posted a black square on Instagram, or you promoted a book to read which you never read yourself, or you I don't know, pledged to do better as an organization and didn't do anything. You know, that's kind of what we mean by performative allyship. So even though your heart maybe was with the cause, it never kind of went beyond the act of showing that, yes, I agree with this movement, and that was it, really. So like I said, it's ongoing, it's continual, and it's something that we really should be committing to if we're going to proclaim it. So remember, allyship isn't just about you. That's what I want to kind of round up on. It's not something that you are doing to make yourself feel better, or it shouldn't be. And it's not there, like I said earlier on, to take away from any guilt that you or I may be feeling about a situation, or how we handled something, or whatever it may be, what's going on in the social climate. It's not about that. It's about ensuring that the causes and the voices that need to be brought to the forefront are given the space to be able to do so. And sometimes that means that you take a backseat. But being an ally takes you from essentially a non, which is kind of this passive allyship, to the anti, which is this active way of demonstrating that. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Victoria. Temba, Ellen, did you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, for me, Victoria, it's all about that that proactivity you were describing, of actually it's an active process of not just agreeing with the messaging that you see on social media, or starting the tentative bits, but actually really proactively amplifying the voices of those with lived experience, and recognizing that it's not just about saying, oh well, I don't do that myself, or challenging something when you see it, but not just about when you see something that's not right, but that when in every walk of your life and everything that you're doing. I loved what you said about countering the stereotypes and proactively looking for opportunities to go against the things that you might automatically look for or might automatically do, and being really conscious about it. There's so much we do unconsciously. It's that thing about being so conscious and deliberate. I think that's the really powerful bit, and the bit, exactly as you say, that elevates it beyond a really passive process. Awesome.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, thank you so much, Victoria, and everyone actually. And I think for me, and you touched on it very well around self-reflection, and Helen also touched on it, that authenticity. My nan always says that you should just clean your side of the street and everything should be fine. And I think it always starts with ourselves, and understanding that we all have our biases and all our different privileges. I know I'm a heterosexual man who can do a lot of other things, and it's important to understand that and accept that yes, that is certain biases that I hold. But that self-reflection really is a process. Back to what Helen said as well, it's not a quick fix. But what we can do is have these conversations and have those unfiltered conversations, but also respecting each other as well with the trauma-informed principles as well. So thank you ever so much. Touched on that really well.
So we've got one question already in the question box, and for those who might have joined the webinar slightly later, do feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. I'll read out that first question to you guys, and then you can decide who answers. It says, I have found a real issue with discussing issues of race and experienced much discomfort from others around the topic. How do we have those difficult conversations? Who wants to take the first answer?
I'll go ahead. I think it's always going to be a difficult conversation. I think that first step is actually good, that to acknowledge that they're going to be difficult conversations. And it's back to what I said earlier on. I think these things take time, and it is a process. And there's certain things around listening to why it is a difficult conversation. Now, I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, and he's got a book starting with the why. And basically that's in my opinion best way to start some of these things, is to really try and understand why is it that this is not working, or why is this not a trauma-informed space or place to be able to discuss these kind of things. So I think the real thing would be to explore the why and listening to those issues. I think that's really, really important.
I think as well, also, you don't have to come with answers as well. And I think sometimes people get into conversations like this with thinking, oh, I have to either, I don't know, justify my belief system, my thoughts, or my actions, or the actions of others that may look like me, or have to apologize on the behalf of others, that kind of attitude. And I don't think that is necessarily what you have to do when you are part of discussions like this. I think it is, when we're talking about racial trauma, I think it's just more powerful to really listen to what people are actually saying in that, and look at ways in which, even with the person, if you want, if that space allows for it, to look at ways in which that they can be supported, as opposed to you coming with your own kind of, I don't know, input of this is how it should be, and I apologize for this. Like, I feel like you don't have to do that. But again, as I've said, it's never going to be comfortable. So I don't think we should be looking for it to be comfortable, because we are talking about something that's not nice, to happen either. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Victoria. There's something about the curiosity about it that's always a good way of opening conversations about things that are difficult. Is that kind of, help me out here. I'm I'm curious, and I'm authentically so. You know, this isn't because I feel like I've got the answer. It's quite the opposite, or even that I'm seeking to fix something. It's actually just a genuine, coming from a genuine place of curiosity, and coming along to that and acknowledging the courage required to start those conversations, and to, exactly as you say, sit with that discomfort, because that discomfort will never be as uncomfortable as hatred. And I think that's something that, you know, if you come from that place of recognizing that it will never feel as uncomfortable as that, it's the starter for 10 at least.
Thank you. So we've got another question. What's the best approach to call out bad attitudes or behaviours without being seen as attacking? And it says very hard as it's so emotive. So what's the best way to call people out without, you know, attacking them?
I mean, I think that it depends on the situation, the context. To be honest, there's so many different ways you can do this, and I don't think there's one way, like, for all kind of thing. But I think you have to really know the space in which you're holding that conversation. I think sometimes when you come with an attack, or when people feel attacked, they can shut down. So whatever message you're trying to deliver, they're not going to hear it. That's already been closed. So it could be that you take that person aside at a later stage, even if it's in a meeting, I don't know, but you just take them aside, maybe have more of a one-to-one with that person. It could be that if it's kind of a bigger thing that you want to kind of escalate, you could find somebody that you trust that you can speak to around that, and you know, say, did you see or did you hear what I heard, or am I kind of overthinking this, and having more than one person kind of really looking at what actually happened there, and that way, and then look at how you can address that with that person. If you want to call it out in the situation, it could just be something simple like, you know, that's an interesting point you've got to make. You know, where did that idea come from, or why do you believe that, you know, that kind of thing, or what was your intention with that remark, or, you know, by saying that remark. There could be things like that which may not necessarily cause a big debate or make them feel attacked, but kind of come from like a conversational thing. But it just depends on the situation. I don't know, that's just my thought.
No, I totally agree with you. I guess it's quite broadcasted, isn't it? And it's all contextual as well. But I've probably referred to it so many times, but my grandmother, I'll use her as an example, and how I think it's so important to just have a space whereby people feel safe as well to have conversations, uncomfortable conversations, and not feel attacked. And my grandmother, her model, which works very, very well, is really around really just sitting down and really understanding where everyone is coming from. And it's not to quiet anyone's voice. It's not to feel as if, you know, this is how I see it, and the way you see it, I disagree, and all this kind of stuff. I think sometimes it's naturally, these things are very emotional. But I think the best approach really is around the conversational element, and listening to each other and being authentic to yourself, but being respectful as well. And as I said, my grandmother uses it. It works very well on us, all my, you know, cousins and brothers and sisters. And I think it is really important when we're in these situations, really, to just respect everyone, but at the same time, you know, just appreciate that everyone's got different opinions on these matters.
Yeah. So I have another question here, which is actually one that I was discussing with Tamba just before we started the webinar, which is around intersectionality. The question here is, how does intersectionality fit with racial trauma? And I'm going to add the discussion that I was bringing up to Tamba this morning, and it's the fact that if a woman goes missing or is murdered at the moment, we mostly get that splashed all over the media when it's a white woman. And similarly, if a black man gets murdered on the street, that also gets splashed on the media. But when it's a woman of colour who is murdered or disappears, they just don't get the same kind of attention, shall we say. So I'm wondering, how do we highlight that? Is it the right thing to actually shine more of a light on that and highlight the fact that there are, you know, people of colour have poor outcomes, that women of colour particularly have very poor outcomes. So yes, just a question for you guys.
Yeah, I think the sort of discussion around intersectionality just absolutely highlights the complexity of trauma, and that there's no such thing as simple trauma. It's that actually every individual experiences their trauma within their own context, and as you layer in gender, sexuality, ethnicity, race, age, the picture gets harder and more difficult to unpick and more difficult to understand. And I think it's doing a disservice to simplify into individual categories of trauma sometimes, I think, because actually it would be highly unusual for anybody to experience a trauma on the basis of an individual thing, because you always have such a huge context in the intersecting elements of your life. So I suppose when we're thinking about difficult conversations, particularly around racial trauma, we have to be really conscious about whether we are simplifying that, and that whether we're not taking account for the fact that this is a conversation we're having with, exactly as you say, a black woman or a black lesbian woman, or, you know, that thing about actually do we need to broaden our lens to think about those things in a more a complete way. It makes the conversations more complex, but I think there's value in always considering all those additional intersecting factors.
Amber, Victoria, any thoughts on that?
I think Helen addressed it really well. The intersectional lens is something that I think we always kind of come from in terms of, I know, you know, from speaking with you all and in Sari as well, like, this is something we always try to look through in terms of, you know, your experience isn't isolated by one characteristic, essentially. And so, you know, as a Black person myself, I have obviously situations and experiences that relate to that identity, but then being a woman as well on top of that, and, you know, another thing. So for me, there's so many layers of impact, really. And so like you said, it's not a one size kind of fits all approach. And that's what I think we all need to really understand. And actually, when you really understand that concept of intersectionality, where we were talking about the challenges of talking about racial trauma and stuff, I think you may be able to relate to some aspect, possibly, for some, because there may be an experience where you can kind of see it, because, I don't know, whether it is related to sexuality, gender, race, or whatever it may be. Yes, there may be an overlying kind of impact, but the fact that somebody's experiencing that with other identities as well, which you could relate to, gives you a point to start with, or a conversation point to identify with. So I think in that aspect, if you really think about it in that aspect, then maybe approaching conversations and talking with people that experience like racial trauma, if you come from that intersectional view, you could also kind of come in from that kind of perspective of, oh yeah, you know, I can't fully understand your racial trauma, but, you know, maybe, you know, with sexuality, I can really understand in terms of how I've experienced this with sexuality, and you can kind of maybe find a similarity there to start that conversation, and then that opens up with the other layers that the other person experiences on top of that with their racial trauma, for example. I'll just give an example there. So yeah, I think it's such a big area to kind of dissect, but it's a good, I think, to get the simple understanding of intersectionality really does help when we're talking about trauma and racial trauma. So thank you so much whoever asked that question.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, and I think yeah, it's really, really important around what you said there, Victoria, around looking at the similarities and not just the differences. And again, it's that accepting that, for example, I'm a black man, I'm a man, and I've got privileges as a man. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just what it is in the society, and really being able to accept that and understand that and realize that we all have our own biases and being aware. And I think, Victoria, again, you touched on it earlier on about the self-reflection element of being the better you and really understanding that it starts with ourselves. And I'll give an example, you know, my partner, who is a black woman, has shown me so many things that I was so unaware of. In fact, I thought I was quite, you know, open-minded and seeing things. And it's really interesting that, you know, this is a process. You know, I don't think everyone will never be perfect, but we all can acknowledge that we all have biases and ways of thinking. And it's so important to acknowledge that and to understand and learn from that and be supportive for whether it's our black women, whether it's people who have disabilities, wherever it is. We just need to be understanding that this is something that this is everybody's business, and this is why allyship is so important. And it's not just racial trauma, it's about, the gender inequalities, disability inequalities, and all these forms of inequalities. I think the human thing to do is really just to accept that this is where I am at, but I can support that person now that I've learned about this. Yeah, thank you.
We have another question, which might well be the last one that we're going to answer today. So without going into any specific debate, there are some conversations out there that are very polarizing. An example given here is the trans debate, but I know that there's lots of other polarizing views out there. So people might hold different views, and in a work setting, how might we hold those views in a safe space, as you suggest? How do we, you know, hold the fact that obviously, you know, racism should be called out, but sometimes views are valid but different, and how do we manage that in those conversations?
I think I'll kick off with that, Nasha, and you know, I think really it's about those relationships, and I think relationships are built on, it's that trust. You trust someone who you know, and if you don't know that person, then you don't know where the lines are. I'm sure all of us can kind of relate to those family debates and conversations on certain things. And the safety there for me, whenever I think of those situations, is the fact that we have those relationships. And that, again, is a process. It takes time to understand people's views, because someone's view, in my opinion, has come from somewhere. And if you don't know where it's come from, and if you don't understand why that person is, regardless of if I agree with it or not, it's come from somewhere. And I think that empathy and that understanding of that, oh, that person's come, this is where they're coming from, I think makes the conversation a lot easier. It's never going to be easy conversations, and especially in relation to that question in a work setting where there are boundaries and stuff. But I think the starting point is to start having those conversations and really, you know, showing those behaviors that we all respect each other.
Yeah, that absolutely, Tim. The word that came to my mind was compassion, and I think coming to those conversations from a place of compassion for where that view comes from. We're all subject to a system that's oppressive in lots of ways. We've all, however that system acts on you, everyone comes to that from a system that is in that way. And I think if we start from a place of compassion and for genuine listening and hearing, and we model those skills, you know, in those workspaces where you really do engender a culture that says we will hear one another and we'll respect views and we'll challenge appropriately and safely, and we try to take the personal out wherever we can, so that you can bring that kind of courage to those conversations. It's really difficult, and the relationships are the key thing. But I guess if you're trying to retain that sense of being human and knowing that difficult conversations and viewpoints that are polarized bring tensions, but that how you find ways of being human to diffuse those are the really important parts of those conversations. It's really difficult. It's not easy, and it's really uncomfortable. But I think there's something about keeping that learning mind and that kind of mindset that says every interaction is significant and important and brings us different learning.
Definitely. I just want to add as well, I mean, kind of extending maybe past this question, but I think it's also important to understand, like, well, I guess to develop cultural competency in the sense of understanding that, so for example, you know, when we group people together, like BAME, for example, I'm just giving an example here, understanding that, first of all, not all Black people have the same experience, not all Asian people have the same experience, and then the other group that we put as minoritized ethnic, like, that's just so wide, like, what, you know what I mean? So understanding that people culturally come from different experiences within those groups that we've created to describe people, and so when you understand that, then maybe you can also understand that people in these conversations, their points that they're making, even though they may be different to what we're saying, really stems from, like I said, I think earlier on, it stems from an experience that they've had, or I know for some of the time it can stem from, like we've mentioned, media and things like that. And I think that's quite easy to maybe identify when it's like a media kind of influence, or, you know, that kind of stereotypical view. But if it's talking around if someone's saying it's an experience that they've had, for example, I think we shouldn't kind of just negate people's experiences. I think we should kind of bring them to the conversation and, you know, kind of show that, yeah, I have this view, you have this view based on our experiences. And that's okay to have that. But also understanding that sometimes the dangers of having certain views can be. And I think that's the conversation. It's not necessarily taken away from experience. It's just saying, you know, that sometimes, depending on what the view is, whatever it is, but sometimes it can be dangerous. And this is why. This is the impact it can have on people.
Thank you. I'm going to have to wrap up. We had a few more questions come through. So what I might do, Temba and Victoria and Helen, is I will email them to you. And then if you give me your answers, we can feed them back to the audience as well later on. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Temba, Victoria and Helen. That was amazing. I've gotten a lot out of it, so I'm hoping that people watching at home also have a lot out of this. I think it was definitely very educative. So there we go. Thank you for joining us today, and I will send you the links that were referenced in today's session, and I will send you a link to the recording as well. And yes, that's it. Have a lovely day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. And
Bye.
please take care of yourselves. Thank you so much. Cheers.